People like you don't deserve real loans. Those were the first words out of his mouth, not a greeting, not a question, not even a glance at the papers she had carefully prepared. Just a sentence designed to cut, to humiliate, to remind a black woman standing in a bank lobby that in his eyes she was already beneath him. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more jaw-dropping stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's get back to our main character. People like you don't deserve real loans. Those were the first words out of his mouth, not a greeting, not a question, not even a glance at the papers she had carefully prepared. Just a sentence designed to cut, to humiliate, to remind a black woman standing in a bank lobby that in his eyes she was already beneath him. The clock above the counter read 8:47 in the morning. It was an ordinary weekday in the heart of the city, people rushing to make deposits before work, customers waiting in line with checks and withdrawal slips. The hum of computers, the shuffle of shoes on polished tile, the polite murmur of transactions. And then, shattering that normalcy, came his voice, sharp, smug, deliberate. The teller's name was Chad Myers. He had worked in that branch for 9 years, long enough to believe he could size up anyone who walked through the glass doors. He prided himself on it. He thought he could tell, just by the way someone dressed or spoke, whether they were worth his time. And when Ava Richardson stepped up to his counter, calm and professional, carrying a folder of documents, Chad didn't see a potential client. He saw someone to dismiss. He didn't glance at the papers she slid toward him. He didn't bother asking questions. He simply leaned forward, smiled in that arrogant way people do when they know they can humiliate without consequence, and delivered the sentence he believed defined her. People like you don't deserve real loans. A silence followed. The kind of silence that stings. A man in line shifted, uncomfortable, but said nothing. A woman holding her toddler looked down quickly, pretending not to have heard. One customer cleared his throat and stared at the floor. Everyone heard the insult, but no one spoke. And Ava? She didn't flinch. Because this was not the first time someone had decided who she was before she had the chance to speak. She knew that tone, that arrogance, that refusal to even consider her humanity. She had encountered it in classrooms where professors doubted her intelligence, in boardrooms where colleagues mistook her composure for weakness, in meetings where her ideas were credited to men who repeated them louder. This was not new. But familiarity did not lessen the sting. Still, she stood her ground. Her voice was steady, her words precise. She said, "My application is complete. Process it." Chad chuckled. Not because anything was funny, but because mockery was the point. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Listen," he said slowly, "I've been doing this a long time. I can tell when someone's wasting my time. Honestly, do you even have steady employment?" It wasn't a question. It was a performance, delivered loudly enough for the whole lobby to hear. The implication was clear: you don't belong here. Ava kept her composure. She repeated her request, calm, unshaken. Her documents were in order. The numbers were sound. She asked again, firmly, for him to process the application. And still, Chad refused. He pushed the folder back toward her without opening it. His voice dripped with fake politeness. "Try somewhere else. Somewhere, more your speed." Those last 3 words carried a cruelty sharper than any outright insult. More your speed. It meant not this bank, not this level, not this world. It meant go back to wherever it is I think people like you belong. The room shifted. People in line shuffled awkwardly. A low murmur rose and fell. Everyone recognized what was happening, but still, no one interrupted. They all became witnesses in silence, spectators to a humiliation that felt far too familiar. Ava gathered her documents slowly, carefully, refusing to let him rush her. She didn't stoop. She didn't apologize. She didn't break. She held his gaze for a moment longer than expected, then said clearly, "You've made yourself very clear." And she walked away. Now, here's the part Chad didn't know, the part no one in that lobby knew. Ava Richardson wasn't some desperate applicant stumbling into the wrong bank. She wasn't someone begging for approval. She was the CEO of Richardson Financial Group, a private equity firm with a portfolio stretching across multiple industries. She had graduated magna cum laude from Harvard. She had earned her MBA from Stanford. She had spent over a decade building companies that others thought would fail. And on this very week, her firm was finalizing a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The target of that deal? This very bank. The papers were already signed. The transfer of ownership was already in motion. By tomorrow morning, the corporate announcement would be public. And by then, every teller, every manager, every executive in that building would be answering to her. But Chad didn't know. The people in line didn't know. And Ava, in her wisdom, didn't reveal it. Not yet. Because Ava understood something about power that men like Chad never would. Power doesn't always announce itself in the moment. Sometimes, the greatest strength is letting arrogance dig its own grave. So she left that lobby not as a defeated applicant, not as a hopeless case, but as a strategist who knew tomorrow would bring a reckoning. And if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been dismissed before your story was even read, you know the kind of fire burning in her chest as she stepped back into the cool morning air. You know the anger, the pain, the quiet determination that says, "This isn't over." Because the truth was already set in motion. The next day, the woman he mocked, the woman he dismissed, the woman he told to try somewhere more her speed, would own his entire bank. And when that announcement came, the silence that followed would last far longer than the one in that lobby. But to understand why that sentence in the bank lobby mattered so much, you have to know who Ava Richardson really is, and what it took for her to stand in that moment without breaking. Ava was never given the benefit of the doubt. From the beginning, she had to fight twice as hard just to be taken half as seriously. In college classrooms, she watched professors turn to her white classmates for the real answers, even when she was the one who had done the work. In internships, she saw managers smile politely while ignoring her recommendations, only to praise those same ideas when they were repeated by someone else with a deeper voice and lighter skin. When she started in finance, the comments became sharper. "Are you sure you belong in this field? Do you really understand these numbers?" And sometimes the cruelty was dressed as humor. "We've never had someone like you in this role before. Don't mess it up." They laughed, as if prejudice was a joke. But Ava did not laugh. She learned. She learned to keep her voice calm when others shouted. She learned to bring hard numbers when they brought bias. She learned to turn underestimation into strategy, using every dismissal as fuel. Still, the wounds added up. By the time she was 30, Ava could count more humiliations than victories. But she kept moving. She earned her MBA at Stanford, graduating top of her class, even as classmates whispered that she must have been a diversity statistic. She worked late nights building her own firm, Richardson Financial Group, after being passed over for promotions she had already earned. She raised capital from investors who doubted her until she delivered double-digit returns. And she built a reputation, deal by deal, as someone who could rescue failing companies and turn them into thriving enterprises. The quiet, underestimated woman was now controlling portfolios worth hundreds of millions. But here's the part no one saw when she walked into that bank branch at 8:47. Behind the composure was a woman carrying years of scars. Every cruel laugh, every dismissal, every insult like, "People like you don't deserve real loans," hit a nerve that had been struck too many times before. Chad Myers didn't invent her humiliation that morning, he repeated it. He embodied an entire system that had tried to keep her small. And that's why his arrogance, casual and public, cut so deeply. Not because his words were original, but because they were familiar. Still, Ava understood the game better than anyone. She didn't fight for validation from people like Chad. She didn't argue with men who had already decided who she was. She focused on the long game. And in her world, the long game meant ownership. Control. Power. When Ava left that lobby, she wasn't walking away defeated. She was walking away with knowledge. Tomorrow, this same man would wake up in a world where she no longer needed his approval. Tomorrow, the balance of power would shift so violently that he wouldn't recognize the ground under his feet. But the weight of that morning lingered. As she stepped into the street, she thought of her grandmother, a woman who had worked as a housekeeper in the South, saving every dollar she could just to send Ava's mother to college. She thought of her mother, who had been one of the first black women in her accounting firm, carrying herself with grace even when co-workers called her too aggressive for daring to speak up. Ava thought of those generations of women, and how they had faced insults sharper than the one Chad had delivered, and how they had still risen. And in that moment, Ava made a silent promise. She would not let this bank teller, or anyone like him, write the story of her worth. She would let her actions speak louder than his arrogance. The papers were already signed. The acquisition was already sealed. In less than 24 hours, the press release would go live, the announcement would hit every financial outlet, and her signature would be the one stamped across the future of the entire bank chain. But inside that lobby, no one knew. All they saw was a woman dismissed. All they heard was a man's cruelty. And all they remembered was the silence of witnesses who chose not to intervene. That silence, Ava thought, was almost louder than his words. Because silence is complicity. Silence is agreement dressed as passivity. Silence is what allows arrogance to survive. And Ava had spent her whole life preparing to break that silence. So when she walked out of that branch, her step steady, her head high, she was already carrying the weight of the storm about to come. She knew humiliation could be temporary, but justice, when it finally arrived, would echo far longer. And that is why this story matters. Because it isn't just about one woman denied a loan. It isn't just about one teller abusing his small position of power. It's about a pattern that has repeated itself for generations, a pattern that says certain people don't belong, certain people don't deserve, certain people don't qualify. But Ava Richardson was not built to accept patterns. She was built to break them. So when you hear those words, people like you don't deserve real loans, understand this, those words were not the end of her story. They were the spark. The moment the match hit the flame. The moment humiliation set the stage for transformation. Because the very next day, in that same bank, in that same lobby, every single person who had witnessed her dismissal would hear a different sentence. A sentence that would flip the story, shatter the silence, and make history inside those glass doors. And when that day came, no one would ever forget it. If you've ever felt dismissed because of who you are, keep listening. This story will show you exactly what happens when truth walks into a room built on arrogance. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, share this right now. The next morning, the bank lobby buzzed the way it always did. Phones ringing. Shoes tapping against polished tile. A faint smell of burnt coffee drifting from the employee lounge. But beneath the surface, there was an extra hum, a sharp edge in the air, because Chad Myers was still telling the story. "Did you see her face?" he said, leaning over his desk to his coworker, grinning like a child who had just won a game. "Walks in here with her folder of dreams, thinks she's going to walk out with a loan. Please. People like that should know better. Waste of my time." His voice wasn't quiet. Chad never was. He wanted the whole room to hear him. To him, humiliation was only valuable if it was witnessed. His colleague gave a nervous chuckle, the kind of laugh people offer when they don't know whether to agree or walk away. That was the thing about Chad, he was a bully, but a calculated one. He knew how to draw people into complicity, how to make silence feel safer than confrontation. And so most people stayed silent, even as he went on, reenacting the way he had leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, smirking at Ava as though her ambition was a joke. He enjoyed himself so much he didn't notice the expressions of the customers in line. The woman clutching her purse tighter, looking away. The young man shaking his head. The old gentleman narrowing his eyes, remembering a time when banks had used the same language to dismiss him. But Chad didn't see. Or maybe he didn't care. By noon, the story had traveled through every office in the branch. By 2, employees in neighboring branches were texting, "Did you hear what Chad said to that woman?" By 5, the whispers had turned into a narrative. Ava Richardson had been put in her place. The arrogance spread like wildfire. Some laughed, repeating Chad's version as if it were entertainment. Others frowned but said nothing. After all, he had only spoken what many quietly believed. And Ava? She didn't respond. She didn't storm back into the branch, didn't call for revenge, didn't send angry letters. To Chad, her silence confirmed his victory. He thought he had crushed her so effectively that she wouldn't dare return. But silence has layers. To Chad, it meant defeat. To Ava, it meant strategy. The city didn't know it yet, but that silence was the sound of gears turning, contracts waiting, signatures already inked. Ava's silence wasn't retreat. It was the deep breath before the strike. Still, in the bank's glass-walled lobby, no one felt the weight of that silence. They only heard Chad's voice, filling the air with smugness, shaping a narrative that would soon collapse under its own arrogance. And that is how tension builds, not in loud crashes, but in the quiet spread of false stories, in the comfort of people who think they've won. Because the higher Chad climbed on his fragile tower of arrogance, the harder his fall was about to be. By the end of that week, Chad's story had become his crown jewel. He told it in the break room over lukewarm coffee, he told it on his smoke breaks outside the revolving doors, he even told it at O'Malley's bar down the street, where the other employees sometimes gathered after hours. "Can you believe it?" he would say, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "She thought she was going to waltz in here and walk out with a loan. No job letter. No credibility. No shot. I cut her off in 3 minutes flat." The way he told it, you'd think he was the hero of the story, the gatekeeper standing tall against people who didn't belong in his bank. And each time he told it, the details shifted. She became more desperate, more pathetic in his version. Sometimes he claimed she begged. Other times he said she tried to cry. By the third retelling, he swore she had slammed her fist on the counter. None of it was true, but the lie was entertaining, and entertainment spreads faster than fact. What Chad didn't know was that Ava's name was already circulating in circles far larger than his barstool audience. Her company's deal with the bank had been under wraps for months, an acquisition sealed in quiet meetings and private signatures. The papers were ready. The announcement date set. And while Chad mocked her over cheap whiskey, Ava was in a glass office 50 floors above the city, reviewing the final numbers with her legal team. But Chad, in his small corner of the world, believed silence meant irrelevance. He mistook her absence for weakness. "See," he told a new teller, a fresh recruit barely a week into the job. "That's how you keep order around here. Don't let people waste your time. Don't let the wrong kind in. She's probably never coming back." The new teller nodded awkwardly, her hands tightening around the stack of forms she held. She didn't say what she was thinking, that the way he spoke made her stomach twist. That repeating the story over and over didn't sound like pride, but obsession. That humiliating a woman for sport wasn't strength. But she stayed quiet. Silence felt safer. That weekend, whispers drifted outside the bank walls. A cousin told a cousin, who told a friend, who posted half a sentence online, "Bank refuses black woman's loan." The post barely got a dozen likes, a handful of comments. But stories have a way of sticking, especially when they tap into something people recognize. And so, while Chad laughed with his coworkers, imagining Ava gone and forgotten, her name was beginning to form a shadow he could not see. By Monday morning, Chad strutted into the branch with a smirk. He had made himself the main character of a story he believed he controlled. He didn't notice the way some customers paused before approaching his desk. He didn't hear the quiet sigh of the assistant manager as she passed him. He didn't feel the weight of the silence that followed him from counter to counter. What he noticed, what he relished, was his own voice. He spoke loudly, smoothly, like a man convinced of his own brilliance. "She'll never show her face in here again," he said that afternoon, when a coworker asked whether he'd heard from the woman. "And if she does, I'll send her right back out the door." It was confidence built on ignorance. And ignorance, when fed, becomes arrogance. What Chad never understood was this: stories don't end when you decide they're over. Sometimes the person you dismiss isn't gone. They're gathering strength, building patience, waiting for the right moment to return, not as the character you wrote them to be, but as the author of a new ending. And Ava? She wasn't done. She was only just beginning. While Chad was polishing his story like a badge of honor, Ava was polishing something far more powerful: the acquisition papers that would make the bank hers. It was Tuesday evening when she sat at the long mahogany table in her firm's conference room, city lights flickering against the glass walls. Around her, a small team of attorneys and financial analysts leaned over binders and laptops, their voices low, precise, confident. "Ava," one of the lawyers said, sliding a folder toward her, "all signatures are in place. The purchase is airtight. The press embargo lifts in 72 hours. Once we go live, this bank, every branch, every employee, answers to you." She nodded, calm, deliberate, but inside her chest, the memory of Chad's words echoed like a scar: "People like you don't deserve real loans." That sentence had already been burned into her resolve. It wasn't the first time someone had said it. Not the first time she had been reduced to a stereotype in a suit. But this time, she held the power to make sure it was the last time it happened in that building. While Ava mapped out the announcement, Chad was still busy turning her silence into entertainment. At 3:14 p.m. the next day, during a slow hour at the branch, he leaned on the counter and told a couple of coworkers, "She won't come back because she knows I was right. You don't get far without proof of stability. And let's be honest, people like her don't last in this city. She'll disappear like all the others." His voice carried over the quiet room. Customers glanced over, uncomfortable. But no one challenged him. They never did. What Chad didn't realize was that Ava's name was already in the hands of the bank's top executives. They knew who she was. They knew her company's assets, her track record, her Harvard degree, her Stanford MBA. They had read her resume line by line, admiring the empire she had built. Chad's ignorance wasn't just arrogance. It was isolation. He lived in a small circle where his words were law, never noticing the wider world that was already shifting beneath his feet. On Thursday morning, Ava reviewed the rollout plan. 9 a.m., Central Time, her communications director confirmed. "The press release goes live. Major outlets are ready. The social media blast follows at 9:05. By 9:15, the acquisition will be public knowledge." Ava closed the folder, her voice steady. "Good. Make sure internal staff hear it directly. No one should be blindsided." The irony, of course, was that one man would be blindsided more than anyone. That night, in his apartment, Chad scrolled through his phone, replaying the story in his mind. He loved how it made him feel powerful. He didn't know he was about to become a footnote in someone else's chapter. Ava's silence had never been weakness. It had been the pause before thunder. By Friday, the pressure was invisible but undeniable. The deal was complete. The stage was set. Ava was ready. And Chad? He was still laughing, still bragging, still blind to the storm that was about to hit. Because arrogance has a sound, and it is loudest right before it's shattered. Friday evening, the branch closed at 6, but inside the corporate tower across the city, the lights were still on. In one of the top floors, executives huddled in a glass-walled boardroom. Documents were spread across the table, screens glowing with spreadsheets and projections. The conversation was crisp, urgent. "This is the biggest acquisition we've had in a decade," one director said, tapping his pen against the numbers. "We need to make sure every branch gets the memo before the press does." Ava sat at the head of the table, listening, composed. To them, she wasn't just a client. She was the new owner. The deal was signed, the ink was dry, and all that remained was the announcement. Internal communication goes out at 8:45, the communications lead confirmed. That gives managers 15 minutes before the press hits at 9 sharp. It'll be controlled, professional, clean. Ava leaned back slightly, her voice calm. Professional, yes. But not sanitized. I want transparency. I want every employee to understand exactly who I am and why I made this move. The executives nodded, but their faces betrayed a flicker of unease. They were used to acquisitions handled with detached language and distant names. Ava wanted more than numbers. She wanted meaning. And while she prepared her statement, Chad was still preparing his own downfall. At the branch that same evening, after clocking out, he lingered near the door, talking to 2 colleagues. You know what kills me? The nerve she had. Walking in like she belonged. No resume, no salary slip, nothing. Just attitude. That's what gets me, that attitude. His words dripped with contempt, the kind that builds a culture of quiet agreement. The others gave him the same half-smiles, the same shallow nods. He mistook their silence for support. By 7 p.m., Ava's press team was finalizing drafts. Sentences were sharpened, numbers verified, $2.3 billion acquisition. 47 branches nationwide. 15 years of expansion. Every fact was ready to be broadcast. At 7:30, the CEO of the bank, soon to be the former CEO, called Ava directly. His voice was stiff but respectful. Ms. Richardson, everything is in order. Tomorrow morning, it's official. Good, Ava replied. And make sure staff understand, leadership will change, but accountability will change more. This isn't just about ownership. It's about culture. Her words hung in the air, steady and uncompromising. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment, Chad sat in front of his TV with a beer in his hand, scrolling through his phone, checking the same sports updates he always did. He had no idea his name was already circling a table of lawyers, attached to complaints, incidents, whispers of misconduct. He had no idea Ava had specifically requested an internal review of branch-level behavior. By 10 p.m., her staff had compiled a file thicker than a phone book. Chad Myers's name appeared more than once. Notes from customers, fragments of complaints, unresolved grievances. It wasn't the whole picture yet, but it was enough to suggest a pattern. Enough to suggest that his story, the one he repeated with pride, was not an isolated incident. And so, as the city went to sleep, 2 stories were running on separate tracks. Chad's, small and loud, fueled by ego and laughter. Ava's, quiet and vast, powered by signatures, contracts, and billions in capital. At dawn the next day, the air itself seemed to hold tension. Saturday was not a typical announcement day, but Ava had chosen it deliberately. Fewer distractions. Clearer spotlight. More weight. At 8:45, inboxes across the bank system pinged. Internal announcement, Richardson Financial Group acquisition. Managers opened the message, their eyes scanning, their voices faltering. Some whispered aloud, Ava Richardson? Wait, isn't that? By 9 o'clock, the press release hit the wire. Headlines formed in real time. Richardson Financial acquires National Trust. $2.3 billion deal finalized. Meet the new owner, Ava Richardson. Phones buzzed. Screens lit up. Conversations broke out across the city. And inside that small downtown branch, the one where Chad still felt untouchable, the first murmur spread like wildfire. A teller opened the news on her phone, eyes wide. She showed it to a colleague. Within minutes, half the staff knew. By 9:10, customers were whispering too. But Chad hadn't seen it yet. He was still at his desk, tapping his pen, thinking about the story he might tell next. He didn't know that the ground beneath him had already cracked. Because arrogance always believes it has the last word, until the truth speaks louder. And the truth was about to echo through every wall of that bank. The pressure is building, and you've only heard the beginning. What happens next will silence a man who thought he owned the room. Don't stop here, the reveal is coming. If you're hooked, drop a comment with the word truth, so I know you're still with me. 9:15, Saturday morning. The city was awake, but inside the bank's downtown branch, time seemed to freeze. Phones buzzed. Screens glowed. And one by one, people were reading the same headline. Richardson Financial acquires National Trust in $2.3 billion deal. The words were clear, final, undeniable. Ava Richardson, the woman Chad had dismissed, humiliated, reduced to nothing in front of an audience, was not just a customer anymore. She was the new owner. At first, it spread in whispers. A teller leaned across to another, "Isn't that the woman Chad?" The sentence trailed off, but the meaning was sharp enough to cut the air. By 9:20, half the staff had seen the story. By 9:25, customers in line were murmuring. Phones chimed with updates. The branch, once ruled by the hum of computers and the rustle of forms, now vibrated with a single truth no one could ignore. And Chad? He still hadn't looked up from his desk. When the assistant manager finally approached him, voice tight, hands gripping her phone, she didn't start with an explanation. She just said, "Chad. Read this." He frowned, annoyed, but he took the phone. His eyes scanned the headline once. Then again. His lips moved, repeating the words as if they might rearrange into something less devastating. But they didn't. They stayed fixed, black and bold, Ava Richardson. Owner. The silence that followed lasted exactly 6 seconds. 6 long, brittle seconds where the air in the room seemed to weigh more than stone. Then came the first gasp, then the second, then the ripple of voices rising like a tide. Customers turned to one another. Tellers whispered furiously. The branch that Chad had once ruled with arrogance now felt like a courtroom, and he was the defendant, cornered by truth. He tried to laugh, a hollow, choking sound. This can't be right. It's some mistake. Fake news. She wouldn't. But denial couldn't stop the flood. By 9:30, the bank's official Twitter account confirmed it. "We welcome Ava Richardson as the new owner of National Trust. Together, we look forward to a future of integrity, growth, and inclusion." The words, integrity, and inclusion, hit harder than any insult Chad had ever thrown. They weren't just corporate jargon. They were a mirror, reflecting everything he wasn't. At 9:35, Ava arrived. She didn't storm in. She didn't need to. She walked through the glass doors in the same navy suit, the same calm stride she'd worn the day Chad dismissed her. But this time, every step echoed with authority. Every whisper in the lobby bent toward her name. The room fell into a stunned hush. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum softer. Chad froze. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. For the first time in years, he had no script, no sneer, no story to hide behind. Just silence. Ava's voice broke that silence. It was steady, even, sharpened by restraint. "Yesterday," she began, "you dismissed me as if I didn't belong here. You told me people like me don't deserve real loans. Today, I stand here as the new owner of this bank." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need volume. They carried the weight of truth, and that was heavier than anger. Gasps spread through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another muttered, "That's her." Phones lifted discreetly, screens glowing as messages shot across the city. Chad tried to recover, his voice cracking. I didn't mean." Ava cut him off, calm as ice. "You meant every word. And that's the problem." The silence after her statement was surgical. Sharp. Precise. No one dared interrupt it. Then Ava reached into her folder. She pulled out the signed acquisition papers, the official announcement stamped with her name, her signature. She held them in her hand, reading aloud. "Effective immediately, all branches of National Trust are under the ownership of Richardson Financial Group. All employees are subject to review. Accountability begins now. Each word fell like a gavel. Final. Unappealable. Chad's breathing grew ragged. His voice trembled. You can't. But he knew she could. Everyone knew she could. The assistant manager whispered under her breath, "It's real. She owns us." And with that acknowledgement, the hierarchy in the room flipped. Chad was no longer the man in control. Ava was. Completely. At 9:45, Ava addressed the staff directly. Her tone shifted from personal to professional, from the wound he'd inflicted to the future she was shaping. This acquisition isn't just about assets and numbers. It's about culture. For 15 years, this bank has carried 47 complaints of discrimination. 47. And over that time, the company has paid more than $2.3 million in settlements. That ends today. The lobby fell into stunned silence again. Customers and staff alike absorbed the weight of those statistics. Numbers delivered with precision, backed by history. Evidence that couldn't be denied. Every voice matters, Ava continued. Every customer matters. No one will be dismissed, ignored, or humiliated within these walls again. Her words weren't just a promise. They were a sentence, and Chad felt it like a chain tightening around him. By 10 a.m., corporate phones rang across the city. Emergency meetings scheduled. Managers scrambling. The news had already hit the wires, television, and every corner of social media. Hashtags trended. Hashtag Richardson takes over. Hashtag New Era Banking. Screens buzzed with comments read aloud by staff. She bought the whole bank? Legendary. From denied to owner. That's power. Chad Myers better be packing his desk. Chad heard them too. Every notification was a nail in the coffin of his arrogance. And Ava? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She simply let the truth sit in the air like thunder after lightning. The kind that doesn't need to strike twice. By 10:15, the press was outside the branch, cameras rolling, reporters calling her name. But Ava stayed focused on the people inside, the ones who had witnessed her humiliation and now witnessed her triumph. She looked directly at Chad. Not with anger. With something colder. Finality. You tried to write my story for me, she said. But you forgot one thing. I own the pen. And with that, the reveal was complete. The room exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for hours. Staff looked at one another, shaken, humbled, inspired. Customers whispered with awe. And Chad Myers, for the first time in his career, had no audience left to laugh with him. Because arrogance collapses the moment truth arrives. And truth had spoken. That was the moment everything shifted. The power flipped in an instant. If this reveal gave you chills, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that arrogance always collapses under truth. The clock read 10:30. Outside, reporters jostled for position. Cameras clicked, microphones lifted. Inside, the air in the branch was heavy with something no one could quite name: awe, shame, and justice all rolled into one. Chad Myers sat slumped behind his desk, hands gripping the arms of his chair as though they might anchor him against the storm. But storms don't ask permission. They tear through everything in their path. And this one was only beginning. At 11 sharp, an internal memo went out from corporate headquarters. It carried the Richardson financial letterhead and was marked, "Immediate action." Every employee saw it in their inbox at the same time. Every sentence was crisp, precise, undeniable. 1. Chad Myers suspended, pending investigation. 2. All discrimination complaints under review. 3. Mandatory sensitivity and ethics training effective immediately. But one line cut deeper than the rest. We will not tolerate arrogance, prejudice, or the abuse of authority. Leadership must reflect integrity. Staff stared at their screens. Some whispered in relief, others in disbelief. For years, Chad had ruled this branch like a petty king. Now, with one email, the crown had been ripped off his head. By 11:30, security approached his desk. 2 uniformed guards, calm but firm. The kind of presence that signaled finality. Chad's face burned red, his words a low growl. "You can't do this to me. I've given this bank 15 years. 15 years. But the guards didn't argue. They simply stood, waiting. And in that silence, Chad realized the truth: his 15 years of arrogance meant nothing against the power of one truth revealed. He gathered his things, shoving papers and pens into a box. His movements were frantic, desperate. And when he finally looked up, the staff who once cowered under his sneers now looked at him with something different. Not fear. Not pity. Something closer to relief. Because his downfall wasn't tragedy. It was justice. By noon, the story wasn't just local. It was national. Cable news splashed the headline across screens. Woman denied loan now owns bank that rejected her. Clips of Ava's quiet, devastating statement, "You meant every word." And that's the problem. Went viral. Millions watched it, shared it, commented. Within hours, hashtags trended globally. Hashtag justice served. Hashtag Richardson owns it. Hashtag from denied to owner. People who had never met Ava spoke her name with reverence. She became a symbol, not just of business triumph, but of resilience, of turning rejection into power. And Chad? He became a meme. Screens filled with split images, Chad sneering at Ava on one side, Chad being escorted out on the other. The captions were brutal. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. From loan officer to unemployed officer. Imagine losing your job to the woman you insulted. The internet had turned his arrogance into entertainment. And once the internet decides your fate, there's no undoing it. At headquarters, executives scrambled. Conference rooms filled with tense voices. PR teams drafted statements. Lawyers combed through old files. Every leader knew what Ava had uncovered: 47 discrimination complaints, $2.3 million in settlements. But now those numbers weren't buried in legal archives. They were headlines. By afternoon, senators were tweeting about systemic discrimination in banking. Civil rights groups called for deeper investigations. Customers threatened to close accounts if real change didn't happen. The board had no choice. They leaned on Ava, not just as the new owner but as the only figure with credibility left. She became the face of reform. Interviews lined up. Press conferences scheduled. Her calm authority reassured markets, steadied shareholders, and silenced critics. While Ava rose higher, Chad sank further. By evening, Chad sat alone in his apartment. The blinds drawn, the television glowing. Every channel, every website, every notification was about her, Ava Richardson. His phone buzzed endlessly, but it wasn't support. It was fallout. His friends distancing themselves. Old colleagues unfriending him online. Even his alma mater released a statement denouncing his behavior. And then came the email that broke him. It wasn't from the bank. It was from his wife's attorney. 3 lines, cold and clean. Given today's events and your public behavior, my client will be moving forward with divorce proceedings. Custody discussions will follow. The phone slipped from his hand. For years, Chad thought arrogance was armor. That sneering at others kept him untouchable. But arrogance doesn't shield. It corrodes. And in one day, everything he'd built rotted through. The next morning, Ava stood at the podium of a press conference. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. The world was watching. She didn't start with numbers. She didn't start with profits. She started with people. For too long, banking has been a gate kept by arrogance and prejudice. That ends now. Richardson Financial will be a place where everyone is respected, regardless of race, gender, or background. That is not a slogan. It is a standard. Her words rippled across the airwaves. stock tickers surged upward. Social feeds lit with applause. And for the first time in its history, National Trust's reputation transformed from scandal-ridden to visionary. Not because of money, but because of truth. But arrogance dies hard. A week later, Chad appeared on a podcast. The host, hungry for ratings, asked him if he felt remorse. His voice shook, but his words were the same tired script. She tricked everyone. This isn't fair. She humiliated me. The internet pounced. His whining only amplified Ava's dignity. Clips circulated with captions. Still blaming others. Even after losing everything, he can't say sorry. By the end of the day, sponsors pulled from the podcast. The episode was scrubbed. And Chad, once so loud, vanished from public life. Meanwhile, the branch itself changed. New policies rolled in. Diversity programs funded. Bias training mandatory. Customers noticed the difference. Staff felt the relief. And slowly, whispers of humiliation gave way to whispers of hope. Maybe this really is a new era, they said. Every reform was a reminder. The humiliation Chad tried to bury Ava with had become the soil where she grew her power. 6 months later, Ava returned to the same branch. The building gleamed, the lobby filled with new faces, fresh energy. Reporters followed, cameras flashing. She stood where Chad once sneered, and she addressed the staff again. This branch was the place where arrogance thought it could silence truth. But arrogance is fragile. Truth is not. And today, this place is proof of that. Applause filled the room. Staff stood taller. Customers clapped. The air that once stank of humiliation now hummed with pride. And Chad Myers? He watched the clip from a dingy bar, faceless in the crowd, the volume low. No one recognized him. No one cared. The world had moved on. Because consequences aren't just punishment. They're permanence. And his downfall was written in permanent ink. The man who laughed was silenced. The woman dismissed was crowned. And the world was reminded, arrogance collapses the moment truth arrives. The fallout was brutal, and deserved. But this story isn't just about one man's downfall, it's about what happens when arrogance is exposed for the world to hear. If you believe in accountability, tap like, share this audio, and make your voice part of the change. 6 months. That's how long it had been since one sentence shattered a woman's dignity in a bank lobby, and another sentence rebuilt her power in front of the entire nation. In those 6 months, the world had shifted. On a quiet Monday morning, the doors of that same downtown branch opened to a different sound. Not the hushed, tense silence of fear. But laughter. Conversations. The hum of an environment where people no longer walked on eggshells. The posters on the walls no longer showed generic stock images of smiling executives. Instead, they displayed Ava Richardson's new initiatives, equal opportunity financing, community growth loans, transparent lending standards. For the first time in decades, people from every background walked into the bank without dread. A mechanic applying for a small business loan. A young mother opening her child's first savings account. A retired teacher finally able to refinance her home without being talked down to. And the staff? They were no longer stiff, anxious shadows. They greeted customers warmly, confident that arrogance no longer dictated the air they breathed. What had once been Chad Myers' kingdom of sneers was now Ava Richardson's house of dignity. On a rainy afternoon in March, Ava sat in her new corner office, high above the city. Papers stacked neatly on her desk. A coffee mug cooling at her side. She glanced at the framed document hanging on the wall, the acquisition agreement that bore her signature. It wasn't pride that filled her. It was resolve. She thought of the countless times she had been told she didn't belong. The times professors dismissed her questions. The meetings where colleagues spoke over her. The moments she walked into rooms and felt her competence questioned before she even opened her mouth. And yet, here she was. Not because she silenced those voices. but because she refused to let them define her. Her phone buzzed. A reminder, the afternoon press call with national outlets. Another opportunity to speak, not just about business, but about reform. About building systems that no longer allowed men like Chad to thrive unchecked. She smiled softly. Because that was her true work now, not just owning a bank, but reshaping what ownership meant. Across town, Chad Myers sat in a faded recliner. The blinds of his apartment half shut, the glow of the television washing over him. The news played another feature on Ava, her policies, her leadership, her vision. He muted the sound. He couldn't bear to listen. No one called him anymore. The invitations had dried up. The friends who once praised his arrogance as confidence had vanished. He'd applied to dozens of banks, but his name was radioactive. Each rejection email felt colder than the last. Chad had once believed arrogance protected him. But arrogance hadn't protected him at all. It had isolated him, exposed him, and finally, destroyed him. And so he sat in silence, a man forgotten by the system he once thought he ruled. Meanwhile, Ava's reforms rippled beyond the branch, beyond the city. By the end of the year, Richardson Financial had rolled out new lending programs across the nation. Minority-owned businesses saw approvals rise. Women entrepreneurs gained access to capital that once seemed unreachable. Complaint hotlines were staffed by independent auditors, not buried by corporate silence. The numbers spoke for themselves. Loan approval disparities that once stretched like a canyon began to close. Transparency reports showed accountability where secrecy once lived. The same industry that once scoffed at Ava now watched her every move, some out of admiration, others out of fear. But either way, they watched. Because she had set a new standard. And once a new standard exists, there is no going back. But the most powerful evidence wasn't in spreadsheets or press releases. It was in the voices of the people her leadership touched. A single mother in Detroit wrote a letter. For the first time, a bank treated me like a person, not a problem. I opened a business account today because of your policies. My bakery is no longer a dream, it's real. A veteran in Texas sent an email. After years of being told no, I finally got a loan to expand my repair shop. You didn't just change numbers on paper. You changed my life. A college student in Atlanta posted online. I walked into a branch and felt respected. That's never happened before. Thank you, Ava Richardson. These weren't just stories. They were proof. Proof that when one woman refused to bow under arrogance, millions stood taller because of it. As spring turned to summer, Ava attended a major financial conference in New York. Executives from around the world gathered. Some expected her to blend into the old rhythm of corporate jargon. But Ava spoke differently. She didn't open with profit margins. She opened with people. Power, she told them, is not in denying others. Power is in building doors wide enough for everyone to walk through. The room fell silent. And in that silence, a shift occurred. Not everyone agreed. Not everyone cared. But no one could deny her presence. No one could ignore her truth. Because truth, once spoken, never fades. 6 months after that humiliating morning in the lobby, the world no longer remembered Chad's smirk. What they remembered was Ava's calm voice cutting through arrogance with precision. They remembered the day a woman who had been dismissed as undeserving revealed she was, in fact, the owner. They remembered that arrogance may shout, but truth always outlasts it. And so, the epilogue of this story is not just about Ava or Chad. It is about everyone who has been told they don't belong. Everyone who has been dismissed, doubted, underestimated. Because Ava's story proves something undeniable. When arrogance tries to bury you, it plants you instead. And when you rise with roots deeper than arrogance can ever reach. So, if you've been listening, carry this with you. The next time someone tells you people like you don't deserve, remember Ava Richardson. Remember that one sentence of dismissal can collapse, but one act of resilience can rebuild an empire. Ava Richardson's story doesn't end with her victory, it's a reminder for all of us. When arrogance tries to bury you, it plants you instead. If this inspired you, subscribe for more stories that prove truth outlasts arrogance. And share it, because someone you know needs to hear this today. And never forget, arrogance may win moments, but truth wins history.